For 40 years, the Middle East was organized around a single structural competition: Iran versus Saudi Arabia, Shia versus Sunni, the axis of resistance versus the Abraham Accords. Every conflict in the region, every proxy war, every diplomatic alignment could ultimately be traced back to this binary. It was the organizing logic of everything from Lebanon to Yemen, from Syria to Bahrain. That binary is over. Iran's military capacity has been degraded by the most intensive American bombing campaign since Iraq in 2003. Its axis of resistance, the network of proxy forces that extended Iranian influence from Tehran to Beirut to Gaza to Sana'a, is structurally broken. Hezbollah is exhausted. Hamas is destroyed. The Houthis have been weakened. The Syrian regime that anchored the land corridor is gone. And the solid relationship between Iran and Qatar, once one of the region's most durable back-channel partnerships, was severed the moment Iranian missiles struck Ras Laffan, Qatar's primary gas export facility, on March 18th. But here is the detail that almost nobody in the mainstream coverage is analyzing correctly. Israel did not fill the vacuum. America did not fill the vacuum. China, which everyone expected to step into the regional leadership role that Iran's collapse created, has instead quietly distanced itself from Tehran since the conflict began. The vacuum is being filled by a coalition nobody saw coming. And if you understand why this coalition exists and what it actually wants, you will understand the Middle East of the next decade better than anyone relying on the old binary. I want to walk you through the game theory, the structural history, and the specific incentive structures that produce this new bloc. Because what is happening right now, in the space left behind by Iran's collapse and Israel's isolation, is one of the most consequential regional reconfigurations in a generation. The global order is shifting faster than the news cycle can report. Hit subscribe to stay ahead of the curve, because what I am about to show you changes everything. Let me start with the two parties who did not win, because understanding who lost helps explain who won. Israel is the country that militarily achieved the most. Its air force, combined with American power, destroyed Iran's nuclear infrastructure, degraded its ballistic missile arsenal, and eliminated the senior leadership of a regime that had threatened Israel's existence for 40 years. By any conventional military measure, this was an extraordinary success. And yet Israel has never been more strategically isolated in its history. Saudi Arabia will not normalize relations with Israel. It has said explicitly that normalization requires a Palestinian state, which the Israeli parliament voted against in 2024. Qatar's relationship with Israel collapsed entirely after an Israeli strike killed Hamas leaders in Doha in September 2025. Drawing unanimous condemnation from the United Nations Security Council. Turkey has severed all economic and diplomatic ties. Egypt is coldly distant. Jordan, which had the most functional Arab-Israeli relationship of any state in the region, is under enormous domestic political pressure. The IMEC corridor, the trade route designed to anchor Israeli integration into the regional economy, has been functionally suspended. Israel won the military campaign and lost the political war for regional acceptance simultaneously. America faces a different version of the same problem. It has a military presence that is enormous, but a soft power that is spent. The Gulf states asked Washington not to use their territory for operations against Iran. Washington did not listen. Iran struck every Gulf Cooperation Council state except Oman anyway, because Iranian planners treated those states as part of the American military landscape regardless of their stated neutrality. The UAE absorbed more than 650 drones and missiles in the first 48 hours. Bahrain was hit. Qatar's Ras Laffan facility was struck. The Gulf states paid an enormous price for American decisions they did not make. That bill is outstanding, and nobody in Washington has offered to pay it. China was supposed to be the third candidate, the country that had brokered the 2023 Saudi-Iranian normalization agreement. the country that provided the diplomatic architecture for a ceasefire, the country that had positioned itself as the responsible alternative to American chaos. And China did all of those things, but it did not fill the vacuum. It managed the vacuum from a distance. Beijing has not committed troops, treasure, or binding security guarantees to any party in the post-war regional order. China's game in the Middle East is still fundamentally commercial, not strategic. It wants stable energy supplies and expanding trade relationships. It does not want to own the security architecture. Now I want to go deeper, because this is where most people's analysis completely breaks down. The first structural force is the quartet that nobody expected. 2 weeks ago, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt hosted a joint summit and established themselves as the primary negotiating channel between Tehran and Washington. These 4 countries have a combined population of 500 million people. Saudi Arabia holds the world's second-largest oil reserves. Turkey is a NATO member. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. Pakistan possesses nuclear weapons. All 4 have functioning, if flawed, defense industries. All 4 have political and economic ties with the United States. All 4 are members of what Trump calls his Board of Peace. The South China Morning Post described this grouping as covering territory from the Gulf across the Caucasus to Central and South Asia, binding together countries with overlapping interests, interlocking partnerships, and a shared conviction that the post-war order should not be dictated exclusively by the American-Israeli alliance or by Iran and its battered but unbroken axis of resistance. This coalition did not exist 3 months ago. It was produced by the specific dynamics of the Iran war. And understanding why each of these 4 countries is in it tells you everything about what the new Middle East is going to look like. Saudi Arabia is in it because Riyadh wanted Iran weakened, achieved that goal, and now desperately needs stability before the power vacuum produces something worse than Iran. The Middle East Council on Global Affairs has warned that Iranian state collapse could produce borderless wars, mass refugee flows, and ethnic fragmentation, all of which would be catastrophic for Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia's generational economic transformation project. Riyadh got what it wanted from the war. It now needs to manage the aftermath. Turkey is in it because Erdogan has spent 3 years positioning Turkey as the indispensable bridge. The Hejaz Railway Project, the Middle East Corridor Economic Framework, the rapprochement with Egypt in 2025, and Saudi Arabia in 2022, the military presence in Syria. All of these were steps toward exactly the moment that has now arrived. A regional vacuum with Turkey at the geographic and diplomatic center. Fundamental interest in any regional order that keeps the Red Sea open and the Sinai stable. Egypt also needs money. Saudi and Emirati financial support for Egyptian economic stabilization is one of the structural levers that makes Cairo's participation in the quartet both necessary for the others and lucrative for Egypt. Pakistan is in it because it hosted the peace talks, has nuclear weapons that give it a deterrent credibility that none of the other 3 possess, and has a deep interest in the stability of Gulf states where more than 4 million Pakistani workers are employed. Islamabad's economy depends on Gulf remittances. The Pakistan-Saudi Arabia Strategic Defense Agreement, signed in 2025, gave Islamabad both an obligation and an opportunity. The second structural force is what I call the Sunni consolidation paradox. The old Middle East binary was Shia Iran versus Sunni Saudi Arabia. The war destroyed that binary by removing Iran as a credible military actor. But it did not resolve the underlying competition for regional leadership in the Sunni world. It intensified it. And this intensification is the most underreported structural dynamic of the post-war moment. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not fully aligned. Their competition for foreign direct investment is structural and predates the Iran war. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are simultaneously partners in the Gulf Cooperation Council and rivals for the same pool of multinational corporations. financial institutions, and technology companies that are looking for a Middle Eastern home base. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 and Abu Dhabi's various sovereign wealth fund initiatives are competing for the same capital, the same talent, and ultimately, the same role as the region's premier economic hub. The war has intensified this competition because whoever anchors the post-war reconstruction economy, whoever provides the most attractive regulatory environment, whoever becomes the financial hub that the region's stability creates demand for, will define Gulf economic leadership for the next generation. The stakes of that competition have never been higher. There is a second layer of complexity. The UAE bore the heaviest Iranian assault of any Gulf state. More than 650 drones and missiles in the first 48 hours alone. Iranian planners calibrated the strikes on the UAE to be heavier than those on Saudi Arabia, precisely because they assessed Saudi Arabia was most likely to respond militarily. The UAE, which had pursued a pragmatic economic engagement strategy with Iran through what the Atlantic Council called a gentleman's agreement, was punished for a neutrality it thought it had earned. That experience has produced a UAE foreign policy recalibration that is still unfolding. Abu Dhabi is now simultaneously pursuing the petrodollar alternative through yuan-based oil trade, deepening security cooperation with France, and engaging with the new Quartet framework, while maintaining its own bilateral relationships with China and Russia. The UAE is the region's most sophisticated hedger, and its hedging strategy is now more complex than at any point in its history. Turkey is not a Gulf state, but Turkey's geographic position, its NATO membership, its Hejaz railway ambitions, and its presence in Syria give it a different kind of influence in the new regional order. Erdogan is not trying to become the king of the Gulf. He is trying to become the essential connector between the Gulf and Europe. That is a different and in some ways more durable form of regional power. The connector cannot be bypassed. It can only be accommodated. And unlike Saudi or Emirati financial power, which can be replicated by other wealthy states, Turkey's geographic position is genuinely irreplaceable. There is no other NATO member that borders Syria, sits astride the route between Europe and the Gulf, controls the Black Sea Straits, and has a military presence in 3 countries simultaneously. The third structural force is the ghost of the Peloponnesian War. And this is the structural history parallel that I want to leave you with, because it is the one that most accurately captures the danger of this moment. After Athens fell at the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE, there was no single successor hegemon. Sparta tried to fill the vacuum and failed. Thebes rose and fell. Corinth competed. The Persians played all sides. The Greek world spent 30 years in a chaotic multipolar competition before Macedonian Philip resolved it by conquering everyone simultaneously. The resolution was not negotiated. It was imposed by force, by a power that everyone had underestimated because it had been building its strength while the established powers exhausted themselves fighting each other. The parallel is not that someone will conquer the Middle East. It is that power vacuums filled by multiple competing middle powers, each with legitimate but incompatible ambitions, tend to produce instability that lasts longer and costs more than the conflict that created the vacuum. Saudi Arabia wants stability. Turkey wants connectivity. Egypt wants economic support. Pakistan wants Gulf remittances. These interests are compatible enough to produce a coalition, but not aligned enough to produce a durable settlement. The coalition will hold as long as the external threat, represented by Iranian chaos and the risk of further escalation, is greater than the internal competition. When that external threat diminishes, the internal competition will reassert itself. Think about what this means for the ordinary families living in the shadow of this transition. Lebanese families who have watched their country be used as a proxy battlefield for 4 decades, who dared to hope that Hezbollah's weakening might produce a different future, who are now watching a new set of outside powers compete for influence over their territory. Syrian families who survived the civil war and the foreign interventions, who are watching a new Syrian government navigate relationships with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel simultaneously, each of whom wants something different from Syria. Yemeni families, 5 million of whom are facing famine conditions, whose country has been a Saudi-Iranian proxy battlefield for a decade and may now become a Saudi-Turkish-Emirati competition for influence instead. The names of the outside powers change. The structure of the competition does not. The first thing to watch is whether the quartet formalizes. Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt have established themselves as a negotiating channel. Watch whether they establish a permanent institutional format, a secretariat, a regular summit schedule, a charter of principles. Informal coalitions of convenience are common in regional politics. Institutionalized coalitions that develop their own bureaucratic momentum are much rarer and much more durable. If the quartet moves from an ad hoc negotiating format to a standing institution, it will be the most significant new regional organization since the Gulf Cooperation Council was founded in 1981. The second thing to watch is Turkey's role in Syria. Turkish forces are deployed across northern Syria. The new Syrian government in Damascus is navigating a relationship with Ankara that involves both dependency and resentment. Watch whether Turkey formalizes its military and economic presence in Syria through a bilateral defense agreement with the new Damascus government. If it does, Turkey becomes the de facto security guarantor for the Levant, a position that no power has held since the Ottoman Empire. The third thing to watch is Saudi Arabia's Iran policy. Riyadh wanted Iran weakened. It got that. But a collapsed Iran is in some ways more dangerous than a contained Iran. Watch whether Saudi Arabia attempts to establish a back-channel relationship with whatever Iranian leadership emerges from the current political chaos. The 2023 Beijing-brokered normalization was destroyed by the war. But the structural logic that produced it, Saudi Arabia cannot afford to have a hostile failed state on its northern border, any more than it could afford a hostile nuclear Iran, has not disappeared. The fourth thing to watch is China's next move. Beijing managed this conflict from a distance, which was strategically cautious, but left it without a strong position in the post-war regional order. The Beijing summit with Trump will tell you whether China is prepared to accept a diminished regional role in exchange for American economic concessions, or whether Beijing intends to re-enter the regional competition more aggressively once the immediate ceasefire pressure is resolved. China has the financial capacity to fund reconstruction, the diplomatic relationships with all major parties, and the strategic incentive to prevent the new regional order from being defined entirely by American and Israeli terms. Watch whether Chinese investment in Gulf reconstruction, in Syrian infrastructure, in the new connectivity projects, begins to accelerate after the summit. The structural conclusion is this: the Iran war did not produce the simple outcome that its architects expected. It did not produce Israeli regional acceptance. It did not produce American soft power restoration. It did not produce Chinese regional leadership. What it produced instead is something more interesting and more dangerous: a power vacuum being contested by a new coalition of Sunni middle powers, each with genuine capabilities and incompatible ultimate ambitions, operating in a region where the two traditional anchors of stability are simultaneously weakened. The quartet of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Pakistan represents a genuine new force in regional politics. It is not a formal alliance. It does not have a military command structure or a mutual defense guarantee that has been tested. It is a coalition of interests that converged in a specific historical moment. Whether it becomes something durable, or whether it fragments as its members' interests diverge, is the central question of Middle Eastern politics for the next decade. This is not prophecy. This is structural history combined with game theory. I might be wrong about whether the quartet formalizes or fragments under the weight of Saudi-Turkish competition for regional leadership. I might be wrong about whether China re-enters the regional competition aggressively, or accepts a diminished role. If I am wrong, we will come back and analyze why. Save this analysis. Come back in 6 months. Check whether the quartet has institutionalized. Check whether Turkey has formalized its Syria presence. Check whether Saudi Arabia has opened a back channel to Tehran. Check whether Chinese reconstruction investment is flowing into the region. The answers will tell you whether the new Middle East is taking the shape this structural analysis predicts, or whether the vacuum has produced outcomes that nobody modeled. Subscribe if you want to follow this as it develops, because the story of who fills the space left by Iran is the story of what the Middle East looks like for the next generation. And the answer is not the one that either Washington or Beijing expected.